There are a lot of types of ink you can choose to draw with, so why would you pick one over another? Let's take a look. Today I'm going to be drawing with 6 different kinds of ink, and of course pencil to get us started as well. As we go over each, I'll do some quick spheres, cubes, and probably a tentacle or root, and share my thoughts about them, what uses they might have in your artwork as well. Keep in mind each is viable for their own ends, and they can easily be combined too. Let's start with pencil though, with non-ink, just so we have a starting point that everyone knows and is comfortable with. As per usual when doing these kinds of things, I like to start with spheres and cubes. First of all, they're simple shapes, and that's always a good starting point. A sphere, for example, has rounded edges, so we get to practice this gradual gradient kind of shading. On a cube, obviously we have flat planes, and so light is going to affect those differently, unless it's very, very close. I always start with these kinds of things when I try a new medium, and I think this is beneficial for most artists as well. The reason is simple. If you try to dive into something more ambitious, a dragon, a robot, something really complicated, and you don't really have a good handle on the medium, it's easy to accidentally disappoint yourself, to mess with your expectations. If you start with something simple, something you've done hundreds, if not just dozens of times, the chances of it turning out well and actually giving you a feel for the medium is much higher. And we all need those early wins when we try diving into something new. A pencil, of course, is giving me nice gradual gradients with my shading. I have the ability to push softer and to get these really nice light tones, and I have the ability to push really hard and get very dark tones. Something that we've all done very many times, I am sure. But if you haven't, I would encourage you to practice with this as well. In fact, if you are not following along, I would encourage you to pause the video for a moment to go grab just whatever random pens you have lying around the house, and as you watch and listen, to draw along. Most of what I'm going to use today are pretty simple things that you will just find lying around. The only exception, perhaps, is going to be my microns. But I use a Sharpie at one point, a regular ballpoint pen. I use some pretty standard things. And the nice part about this is that they're all justifiable. They all have different purposes, things they do well and things that they don't do quite as well. Obviously for this square, we have flat surfaces, so each of them are going to be more reflective of a singular type of value. The top is going to be our highlight, the right side in this case is going to be our midtone, and the face that is coming towards us is the shadow. The cast shadow, of course, is then thrown onto the ground, as it always is, or whatever surface is close enough to catch that shadow. I'm going to speed things up here for a few seconds as I work on the actual drawing at the end. Like you have probably encountered as well, sometimes when I get to this point of sampling a new medium, I'm not sure exactly what to draw. I find that more intricate shapes can be troubling, and I've been working a lot with trees and roots, branches, and also octopus tentacles recently, so this is what I went to. I'm giving myself an interesting shape to work with, something that allows me to practice multiple kinds of shading, and I think that's important as well. We're going to go ahead and start moving on to ballpoint now, the actual first of our inks for this ink video. Go figure, huh? Ballpoint is one of my favorite mediums to draw with. I know that might seem silly or weird because it's such a common medium. It's something that we have sitting around the house. You probably have accidentally taken one from a bank or from some kind of business before. Maybe you've come home with a couple dozen over the years from your place of work. But they are actually a really lovely medium to draw with. That little ball at the end that takes the ink and rolls it onto your paper leaves a physical material, but also not such a high quantity of ink that it's easy to smudge. Yes, you can smudge ballpoint, but it's much, much harder to smudge it than it is a lot of other forms of ink. It still allows for the gradual shading like you see with a pencil, which is one of the most wonderful aspects from my perspective when I go to work with ballpoint. In addition, because it allows you to draw softly, it's a little bit more forgiving, and it's a little bit less stressful to get started with. You can do things quickly, you can put them together quickly, you can work on your second and third layers without having to worry about things underneath drying. And again, you can smear it, but it doesn't happen nearly as easily as it will when you're working with something like a gel pen or a Sharpie or even a Micron, or goodness, if you start working with a dip pen at any point in time, which we will actually be doing further on in this video. As per the other, I am going to then go into a cube. This one is at a slightly different perspective, partially to keep me from being bored, and also because it's good to practice your perspective drawing, and I will try to do so whenever I am given the chance. The biggest problem that I run into with ballpoint pens is actually that I will shade too quickly, and I will have these random lines that go outside of the area that I'm working in. You can actually see 2 of these right now. But ballpoint is a great entry point. If you are curious about ink or ink stresses you out, I would encourage you to start here because it's just a lot more forgiving. You can work down some really light lines to begin with, and it's not a problem. You can pretty easily work ballpoint over top of pencil lines too if you want to sketch things first, though if you're working with ballpoint, I would encourage you to just try doing everything with it. Since you can draw so lightly, it's a good sketching medium as well as a good finished drawing medium. And it's good for most of us, especially if you haven't practiced a lot drawing lightly, to get some practice in just drawing really, really light lines and getting them to form out what you want. I'm doing another kind of random shading exercise here, a little bit more complicated than the first. This one reminds me a little bit of coral, though I don't recall in the moment whether that's what I was trying to do or if I was simply practicing my shading. This is again a beneficial thing to do with any medium, so if you are picking up ballpoint for the first time, I would encourage you to draw something sitting around at your dining table or on your kitchen counter, your hand perhaps, and if that's too intimidating, just pick something that looks rather simple. Don't take your new medium and dive into something complicated where you're going to have a high level of expectations and therefore a higher chance of running into disappointment. Ink can be intimidating for a lot of people, predominantly because it has this reputation of not being fixable, of being graceless and not forgiving. While that last pen was a simple Bic Ballpoint pen, this one is actually a Uniball, which feels a little bit like a hybrid between the simple ballpoint and a gel pen. I do believe it is actually a ballpoint, but it is just a nicer variety. It's easier to smudge this because it leaves a little bit more ink on the page, but it still dries fairly quickly and can be pretty forgiving when you're giving it just a few minutes to dry before working over a subsequent layer. I picked this up primarily because these are also a common pen to just have lying around your house, but they are a little bit different. It's harder to get those really soft lines with this, but it also leaves much darker marks when you put it down, and for some people and for some situations, that's going to be more ideal. This pen, for example, I would be much happier writing with, because it's going to leave consistently dark marks on my page as I do that. Whereas the Bic is going to be my preferred drawing pen, although ironically it is generally far cheaper. You can usually get a whole batch of them for not very much money at all. And again, like I alluded to earlier, they often give them away for free at a lot of local businesses because you can buy them in bulk. This pen, with its darker marks, lends more towards a hatching approach. So we're breaking a little bit away from the delicate shading of the ballpoint and moving into something that favors a slightly different approach. As with the others, I'm going to move into making a box or a cube as my second shape here. This is a little bit more difficult, I have to admit. I like the really light lines that I can get with that just standard, typical ballpoint pen. This requires me to be a little bit more consistent in my lines, and you can see as I go to do it, I'm being fairly sketchy. Now, granted, this is happening in part because I'm recording a video. Generally, if I have to make long, straight lines like this pen requires, I'm going to shift my sketchbook or my paper so that my wrist draws those lines in the easiest way possible. For me, this is drawing lines directly toward myself, so those vertical lines are fairly easy, but the others can be a little bit more difficult. I would encourage you, whenever you feel the need, if a motion that you're trying to make with your pencil or pen feels awkward, to rotate whatever surface it is that you're working on. Sometimes you don't see this in internet videos because it's often not particularly photogenic, videogenic in order for people to watch it easily. It makes the video a little bit harder to view, especially if things are sped up. But I would encourage you, as you are just drawing things at home, maybe watching something or listening to something, you have no rules like that you must abide by. So I would encourage you to just shift your materials so that they work for you, so that they are taking care of you in the correct fashion. I am leaning far more into a hatching manner of shading as I move on with the tentacle root thing here. But that's just a better way to use this medium in this particular moment. While you can use hatching when it comes to pencil or even a standard ballpoint pen, the dark consistent marks are generally favored, though there are no rules for this. If you like using hatching with lighter sources of mark making, that's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It could be really rewarding to have a series of colored pens or grayscale pens and work with them all using hatching to just show a different way of representing something. It's one of the beautiful things about ink is there are so many different kinds and they each have their own strengths. Speaking of which, we're going to be moving now into probably my everyday favorite, which is my Micron. This one here is a Pigma Micron 01, which is 0.25 millimeters. It is archival ink. It is waterproof once it's dry. It is just a good general all-around pen. You'll notice right off the bat that it is incredibly consistent, like an upgrade from the one we just worked on. But it also, in that same train of thought, has no ability to make lighter marks. Every mark that it makes is the same width, is the same consistency, and is the same level of darkness. This is good in that you always know what you're going to get. Every time you take a pen like this and put it on the page, you know the width of that mark. And in some of the pens we're going to look at later, that is not always the case. The downside is that there are times where you want a smaller mark, a larger mark, or a lighter mark, and this pen is not going to do that for you. Now, you can vary certain things. You can look at this sphere, for example, and see that I've used hatching and cross-hatching on it, and both of those are going to allow me to give the illusion of different levels of lightness and darkness, but they are illusions only. If I had paint, for example, or a lighter ink, I could actually not give the illusion of a lighter mark, but actually give a lighter mark. I still enjoy this pen tremendously. It's what I've used for Inktober for years. It's what I use for a lot of the illustrations I work on in my private life as well. I find the consistency very reliable, and fortunately these come in many sizes. I have another that is half this width, and then I have a bunch that are much, much bigger. I find that varying the actual pen that I use is my preferred way of working. I'll usually start with something like this, the 0.25 millimeter, and then after I've got my basic drawing down, I will go in, I will blacken my shadows and my cast shadows, and then I'll start working on texture with a pen that is even smaller than the one that I'm using here. I'm going to go ahead and move on to my actual drawing for this one, kind of experimenting with it. And you'll see that the lines that are laid down are perfect. Not that I'm drawing perfect lines, obviously, but that they are incredibly consistent, except for the 2 or 3 spots where I just failed to actually connect the pen. That's the thing too, is I'm drawing incredibly lightly with this pen, but because I am drawing so lightly, there are times where I actually just stop touching the page. I can get some very subtle variance. If I'm very lightly touching the page with this pen, sometimes the marks will be a little bit more feathered or a little bit smaller, but it is really, really subtle. If you're trying to get something like that that is more varied, where you have the ability to make darker, lighter, wider, or thinner marks, the next pen that we work with on this drawing is going to be much more advantageous to you. Though, I would argue it's got a much higher learning curve. Drawing with a pen like this is not going to take you a lot of time to learn how to do it. It's pretty straightforward, it's pretty simple. This is not to say that mastering drawing with a pen like this is altogether simple. It's just that the approach is simple. Understanding how the pen functions is simple. I've been working with this kind of pen for probably 10 years now, and I feel like every 6 months or so I hit some manner of breakthrough, using a different kind of hatching, varying my marks in some way. It has been infinitely rewarding, and if there's only 2 pens on this entire list that you commit to giving a try, I would stick with that basic Bic Ballpoint and one of these Microns. I'm going to speed this up again while I finish off this drawing before we head into our 4th ink and our 5th drawing medium. This next one is a little bit more complicated, something that's taken me a long time to feel like I have the most fundamental level of mastery on. This is a Pigma brush pen. It again is made from the same company that the one we just used was, and it again uses that archival ink that once it dries entirely is this pitch black that is waterproof, which is great for working on watercolor or brush pen or anything like that over the top. I forgot to mention that actually with the last one, is that once it's totally dry, it is really receptive to working watercolor over the top of, which is what really made me fall in love with ink in the first place. Now you can tell right away that this is a very different product. The end of this is flexible, which allows me to make really thick marks and really thin marks. The direction of your wrist and the direction that you are holding this pen make tremendous difference. It actually took me a very, very long time to understand how to use this medium, and I really did not like it at first. I tried for a couple months and felt very discouraged, especially after watching videos of people who are far better than me at the medium. It took getting back into it about a year later and really giving it several different drawings, and also the realization that I didn't have to use it as my only drawing medium on a drawing. What I started doing was giving myself these sketchy lines to start a character or a dragon of some kind. And then I would go back in with my other Microns with these smaller pens that are really consistent, and I would use them to get my hatching and my texture in there. That's a happy medium that I've found that I really enjoy. But the more I use this pen, the more I enjoy it, the more it grows on me. But I do have to say that at least for me, it took a long time to develop any level of proficiency. And that might be a little bit of a hurdle. So if you have access to something like this and you can try it out, you can give it a chance, I would encourage you to do so. But if you find that you are easily discouraged, if failing on a drawing or a new medium is a difficult thing for you to endure, I would encourage you to focus on some of the more forgiving mediums first. This one has been a lovely addition, especially working on things like Inktober, because the subtle line variance just gives a quality of life to the pieces. I use this a lot on my robot series, and in that series, I really felt like the robots stopped feeling pristine, like really old science fiction where everything's perfect, and they started feeling a lot more like Star Wars, where things are busted up and broken. They look aged, like they've endured eons, and that makes things feel more realistic. If you think about it, a car only looks perfect for a couple of days, maybe, and then it starts to get dings and scratches, and hopefully not right away, but it will start to get dirty. Real life is dirty. There's lots of dust and muck and grime out there, and we kind of know that instinctively as humans. I find that a tool like this is really good for implying some of that grime. Your lines are not all going to be so perfect that they look fake. They're going to be interesting and intriguing because there's going to be subtle variation in them. Sorry about going off the bottom here. I lost track of where I was for just a moment, but we'll get back on track momentarily. So I suppose to finish off with this manner of pen is, if you're up for a challenge and not easily discouraged, it's fun, and it might click with you. The fact that it took a long time for me to mesh with the medium doesn't mean that you're going to have the same experience. But I think that it's a beneficial thing to share, because I've watched a lot of artists work with these, and I've marveled at the things that they bring into fruition. And so when I got one for the first time and started struggling, it felt very discouraging. And I think this is a pretty common thing with artists. I run into this most frequently every time I try to dive into digital art. I want that tactile sensation. I want things to work the way that they always have because I'm an old man at heart. And so it's a difficult thing for me. And sharing in that difficulty, at least mentioning that those things are difficult, can be really freeing. Because there's a lot of content out there that just makes it seem like, oh, you just need to try this or spend some time doing this and it'll all click. And if it doesn't, the inference, the implication is that something is wrong with you or you are less than. The reality is more nuanced and complicated, as unfortunately reality usually is more nuanced and complicated. This next medium is going to be very different than everything else we've worked with. In fact, I had to cut the footage for a moment because I had to do all my prep work. This is a dip pen. I have dipped it into an inkwell. You've probably seen these in any fantasy setting or in old world things. In Harry Potter, I think they write with quills. This is basically a modern version of that. It is a pen tip at the end that actually holds the ink and puts it down onto the paper, and that fits into a holder. This one is kind of pretty, but most of the ones that I've used over the years have just been a plain black piece of plastic. It doesn't need to be complicated. The actual value here is what is happening in that pen tip. And there are a variety of tips. You can get really broad tips, really fine ones. This one is particularly fine. Probably not quite as fine as my thinnest microns, but some can be incredibly sharp and can give you these really pristine lines. Now, this manner of ink requires a few more tools. You have to actually have the holder, you have to have pen tips, you have to have a well of ink that you can dip your pen into. If you fail to clean it at the end of a session, then the pen will dry and it can clog things up. They're usually cleanable, but it's a few more steps. Ironically, this is the methodology of drawing with ink that I was first introduced to, outside of probably just grabbing a random pen somewhere. When I was in high school, I had a teacher who first allowed us to use dip pens. First of all, it felt magical. As a kid who grew up obsessed with Lord of the Rings and things like that, it was all too fun to dive into something archaic, something that felt different and new. It is much better at making organic lines, I find, though I've used it for working on perspective things like you see here with this little cube. We got exposed to this for the first time, and I remember spilling some ink onto my drawing. I immediately had this sense of panic, like, oh my goodness, I've ruined my drawing and I've spilled ink, I've wasted a material. But I slowly started spreading the ink around, using my pen to just take this glob of ink on my page and move it and turn it into shapes. And it was actually with that mistake, with that accident, that I was able to fall in love with this medium. Because it just felt interesting. It has a tactile sensation to it. It moves as you pull it around the page. It's tremendously different than all of these other mediums. There is obviously no need for something like this these days. You can pick yourself up a Micron or a cheap pen that is way less hassle, and when you're done working with it, you can just put the lid on. However, art is not always about practicality. There is a sense of nostalgia, sometimes not even nostalgia from your own life, but nostalgia from a life prior. Not to imply like reincarnation or anything, I'm just saying that like sometimes we get nostalgic for great ages of humanity that were not our own. And I have that in spades. I love doing old school things. There's something that feels like I'm touching upon some shared piece of history with the rest of humanity. And to me, that feels very intriguing. That feels very fun and cool. And so working with a pen like this is what got me into drawing with ink in the first place. And I think it's worth giving it a shot. Obviously, it's going to take a few more dollars to be able to afford something like this. There's a couple other steps and a couple other tools, but it's one of those things where if you have a birthday or a holiday coming up and you're not 100% sure what you might want, which of course never happens with artists because we always have a tremendous amount of things we want. But if you invest maybe $10 or $15 here in the US, you could get yourself 3 or 4 different pen tips, a pretty basic holder, and a little vial of ink. And the thing here is this is infinitely expandable. There are so many colors of ink you can use. You can use ink washes where you water down the ink a little bit and actually paint with it almost like watercolor. This is something that I would highly encourage you to explore once you know that you like working with ink. You like the permanence of it. You like that darkness. You like working other things over top of it in subsequent layers, perhaps. This is just a fun excuse to play with the medium more. And so if you already know that you enjoy ink, I would encourage you to look into dip pens. I would not spend a lot of money at the beginning. I would just get something simple to see if you like it. And that's actually what I would encourage with most of these pens and inks that we're working with today. I'm going to speed this up a little bit while I finish off with the dip pen. I got kind of excited about this one. I did something different, obviously with the little eye, and then went, oh, I should probably do the tentacle so we can figure out how that works with this medium. So just bear with me for a moment while I do the quick version of this. And then we're going to move into our last pen for the day, which is a rather silly, perhaps, one. It's just a simple Sharpie, which we probably all have lying around our house, right? This is not considered a high-class drawing medium at all, but what does that really even mean? For something like this, if you're going to work on a small scale, I would encourage you to try something like stippling, where you're just using a lot of tiny little dots in order to imply the shading. But I find that Sharpies are really better used on a large format. Imagine I was making this same sphere, but it was 10 times larger. Those microns are going to be really difficult, but working with a Sharpie is going to be fun. Also, if you're anything like me, you've probably drawn on a lot of things that normal ink wouldn't stick to with a Sharpie, maybe including your own skin. Maybe you drew tattoo sleeves on yourself in high school and hid them with long sleeve shirts so your parents wouldn't notice, just like me. Except that when the ink wore off on the inside of the white shirt you were wearing, your mother knew, and then you had to start doing all your own laundry. Sharpies are a fun thing to draw with, though. And especially if you just don't have anything else laying around, they're still a viable option. I did a lot of fun drawings like this with my students when I was teaching middle and high school, where I would take a Sharpie on a loose piece of printer paper, draw a bunch of random marks and run it through the copier a couple hundred times. I would then hand those to my students with fine point Sharpies and tell them that they had to turn that mess of marks into something. This was a really fun exercise for them. A lot of creativity and imagination just naturally comes into effect. And something like that is always a good idea when it comes to a Sharpie. Well, this has been 6 different kinds of ink and exploring how each of them works and what they might be well used for and which ones might work best for you. And of course, pencil just is our metric on the beginning. As always, thanks for watching and listening. I hope this was beneficial for you, and I would love to hear which one of these you enjoy most or you're most excited to dive into next. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.